Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jim Hoven, and it is my pleasure to speak with, visit with, and meet with people who are doing amazing things every single day at lots of levels. And today's guest is someone I've been looking forward to getting on the program for a long time now. He's a new friend of mine who I am just absolutely enthralled with and can't wait to spend more time with every day. And that's good for me because I happen to work with him. And just as by way of introduction, Dr. Don Cooper is going to be my guest today. And he actually is a PhD. He got his undergrad degree at CU here in Colorado at Boulder. And then he went on to get a PhD. And listen, if you're anything like me, you know PhD is far outside of my scope of anything, but he crushed it, and he got that in neuropsychology at the Chicago Medical School and went on to get some even postdoctorate work from that at the prestigious Northwestern University. So we're going to get into Dr. Don's background history, and while it may sound like this is going to be deep information, we're going to make it fun. And by the way, Dr. Don is going to be an ongoing contributor to the podcast with his knowledge on so many things. Bringing science to people, it's really making a difference. So without further ado, welcome my guest, Dr. Don Cooper. Don, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. We've been talking about this, right?
I know.
On coming together. And, you know, it's funny because you and I have known each other just in way of passing because of business that you've done with Dr. Ramos and my affiliation, of course, with the law firm for a couple of years now. But recently, as we introduced the medical sciences division, which we'll get into, you and I have spent much more time together as we're getting that thing off the ground and understanding it. And man, I just find the information in that big brain of yours to be fascinating. So, you know, the things that we do, I think, moving forward in the series of information that we're going to be providing people, I really think it's going to make a difference by shedding light on things from a different perspective. And we're going to do our best to break it down into ways that, you know, high level concepts can be made simple and understandable and hopefully applicable to people's lives as well. So before we get into the science of things, tell us a little bit about you, how you and I have had this conversation, and I was so fascinated by it, which is why I had to ask again, why did you decide to become, I'm going to use this term in quotes, a scientist of all things?
Oh my. That's a big question because I don't know that there was a moment that happened, because when I was in high school, you know, I was in track and field and we'd won the state championship, and I was a four sport letter. And, you know, so I was very much into the decathlon when I went to college and working out all the time. And it was all
about. And
you're
a tall guy. Is that good for decathletes?
Well, you have to have an optimal kind of frame. So I was 6'3", about 180.
Yeah.
You still have to pole vault. So you have to be light enough to pole vault, but you still have to be able to jump and do all these other things. But so I was working out about 6 hours a day in college, just doing, you know, working out. And so consequently, I couldn't take, you know, all the heavy duty science classes. So I was planning on being a journalist or a communications major. And then something happened. That's what happens with a lot of athletes, is that you can't work out anymore. I couldn't be part of the team anymore because of some details with recruiting and whatever. But so I had a friend who was working in science and was doing some work with prenatal exposure to amphetamines in animal models, looking at attention deficit disorders and things like that. And I thought that was very fascinating. So he invited me out to Drake University to do some research. And after that, since I couldn't work out anymore, I devoted all that energy that I had been using towards athletics over to science. And so that's when I started really becoming passionate about understanding how things work.
And is that the basis behind this, Don? Is it how things work, how the body works? Was there something that you said, man, I want to know? Because the level that you've learned things at, it's at we'll call it the micro level of detail and organization compared to the macro level of, oh yeah, I take my key, I put it in my car and I turn it and then I drive away, right? You're doing that for the body. Where did that fascination to detail come from?
Well, I mean, I don't know how interesting it is, but I mean, I grew up at Bethlehem Lutheran. I went to, Christian schools, and when I got to college, I was very fascinated with, as I read more philosophy, I became more fascinated with this concept and this tension between free will and determinism.
Okay.
How much free will do we have? And how much decision making do we have, and are we just a product of our upbringing?
Was that because of the religious connection to the school?
I think so. Well, I think that you come from a religious background, and it's everything's very traditional, and you're taught orthodoxy, and you're taught that there's a certain right way to do things and a certain wrong way to do things, and I think that when you start to go to college, and you start to find out that everything doesn't fit into these easy categories, and you say, well, how do you explain this or how do you explain that? And that kind of tension between free will and determinism really led me into trying to understand drug addiction. And because that to me, that was the best model for how can you take an organism who has a certain set of beliefs or a certain history, and just by adding a drug to their system, you could convert them to someone who would be a full-blown dependent drug addict. You could almost do that with anyone. Wow. And what role do genes play? And so that the idea that genes could play a fundamental role in determining someone's life choices was fascinating to me. And so once you make that kind of decision to go into that, then doing animal models and trying to understand how the brain works was a natural conclusion, all the way down to the molecular level. So if we can manipulate a certain pathway, then will that lead to an animal making a decision towards this or that? Manipulating that, I thought, was very fascinating.
That is fascinating. And so as you went through that process, did something start coming to your mind where you wanted to follow that? Because I know in a PhD program, maybe you can describe something for us. Like my daughter-in-law is currently undergoing her PhD program. She's 2/3 of the way through, and roughly, I mean, that's kind of it's a fuzzy timetable because you got to hit your benchmarks, that kind of thing. How did it go for you between getting your undergraduate degree, deciding to get a PhD, and what's it like to go through the process of getting a PhD?
Well, it's probably different depending on where you go and who your advisor is and what level you're at. And so where I went to Chicago Medical School, and I was constantly I had an undergraduate honors advisor named Al Collins, who was at the Institute for Behavioral Genetics at CU. And his work was in nicotine. So he was well known in his field for understanding how the genetics of nicotine, what makes some people vulnerable to smoking cigarettes and others not, and how hard it is to quit and all that. And he got sick and tired of me pestering him, coming into his office hours every day, trying to pitch my latest understanding of the brain reward circuit to him. And he said, I've had enough. I'm calling up Frank White. He's in Chicago right now. You'd be a great fit, and he's going to take you off of my hands. You go to graduate school with him. So he flew him out, and I went there. And really, Frank was one of the only ones who was doing single cell recordings, and looking at dopamine signaling. And at that time, there were some new developments in genetic technology that enabled molecular geneticists to take human genes and insert them into a mouse or a rodent and humanize them, and then study specific pathways. So at that time, there was the first generation of gene manipulation, gene knockout technology. And so I was part of that. And so at that time, I was just inundated with opportunities to really get at the thing I was interested in, is understanding how a particular gene could control some behavior.
And had the genome all been already discovered at that point in time?
No, this was... At that time, the Human Genome Project was still in its early days, and the technology was billions of dollars projections to sequence the human genome. At that time, we were going on a single candidate gene approach, where we would say, well, we know that, for example, the first project that I had when I got to graduate school. And in graduate school, what happens? I mean, you asked me how it works, but at Chicago Medical Schools, we would start with just a regular medical school background. So we would take a full load of physiology and pharmacology and cardiology, microbiology, and then then after that, we were doing research. The research side of it. was a guy by the name of Susumu Tanagawa. He had won the Nobel Prize in the 70s for his work in immunology. Now he'd made the first generation knockouts of mice, knocking out a dopamine receptor. We all know dopamine and cocaine and drugs of abuse, dopamine is a pleasure transmitter. So his question was, well, if we knock out, there are two types of dopamine receptors, a D1 and D2. What happens if we knock out the D1? How does that affect cocaine? And so when he did that, they sent us the mice, and he said, "Okay, we've made this mouse, but we don't know how to test it. We aren't behaviorists." So Frank turned to me. He's like, "Okay, we've got some work, mouse behavior work you did with Al Collins. So can you tell us what happens?" Well, we got these mice, and we gave them cocaine. Normally, if you give a mouse a cocaine, it runs around like crazy, right? And sniffing everywhere. It's running around as you might expect. But when we gave these D1 knockout mice, they would sit and they would just lie down and they'd go to sleep. So it totally eliminated the behavioral effects and the rewarding effects of cocaine. And that I felt was very fascinating, because that meant a single gene could control a response to a powerful rewarding drug like cocaine.
When that happened, did you flash back to when you were a kid and go,
with my experience with cocaine as a kid?
No, we don't need to talk about that. No, when you said, I wanted to know because of this connection, determinism and fatalism and free choice, where did you say, this was one of the answers that I was seeking as a kid? Did you make that conscious connection?
Yeah, well, once I realized that I hadn't made a mistake and injected the wrong thing into the mouse, because when you have 10 mice running around like crazy, and then you have 10 all lying on their belly, you're like, something interesting and fundamental has happened. And then thereafter, you always have to be skeptical, and you have to look at this and you're like, this is an amazing finding, but we have to understand why. So at that point, we had to then go in and actually record the neurons that respond to cocaine. And then we found that the physiological activity, the neural activity, was completely gone. So we could map it all the way down to the circuit and find out it was completely gone. Well, that's a powerful kind of existential, for me, it's kind of an existential thing, because it means that you can take an organism, and if I could take a human and I could knock out your D1 receptors, I could make you completely immune to the effects of cocaine. Well, the physiological effects of dopamine are something that drive all of us.
Yes.
Otherwise, things wouldn't work. We're motivated by reward, and when we go to see the Denver Broncos, and we are exhilarated by the victories and things like that, and that rush and that surge of adrenaline activates dopamine. If you couldn't experience that, how different would your life be?
Right, much more monotone, much less emotional, I would imagine, much more flat.
You would be anhedonic. You wouldn't find anything pleasurable or anything worthwhile. Yeah. And how would you decide whether to do this or that? So I felt like that was at a core of decision making, and how we incentivize people or organisms to do something largely is determined by dopamine. And what we learned subsequent to that is that dopamine plays a big it's involved with even learning. So the largest surge of dopamine comes from an unexpected positive outcome. So if somebody comes in here right now and says, "Hey, I'm just going to give you $1 million," totally unexpected, your dopamine level is going to go way up. But if you're expecting something, every day you get some routine reward, then all of a sudden that dopamine signal goes down. So how dopamine signaling occurs is fundamental to understanding how we make decisions as humans and organisms.
Let's talk about that. Stay on this for a minute, because the fascinating topic that I think all the listeners could benefit from with respect to dopamine. Dopamine is what I call one of the brain's feel-good chemicals. And there's, dopamine, and you got epinephrine, norepinephrine, you got all these kind of things kind of working together, right, in the system. And I was listening to a podcast recently from a guy we've talked about, Andrew Huberman, who's a PhD guy teaching out of Stanford. And he was talking about the dopamine molecule literally being the motivator for wanting more of something, that it doesn't actually, while it's considered part of the feel-good chemical family, it's not the feeling part, it's the motivation, the driven part. So for people listening, dopamine's really important, right? It's an important part. Like you say, it's a driver of making us want to do things and achieve. What are some ways that the listener could make an actionable plan to get more dopamine in their lives? Because we know it's a positive thing. Is there some behavioral patterns or protocols that they might be able to do to enhance the dopamine experience?
That's interesting. when you talk about dopamine in terms of dissecting its effects from wanting, one of the distinguishing components of dopamine is a guy by the name of Terry Robinson developed this theory that dopamine, you can separate with addiction. You can separate out wanting versus liking. Those two things are not the same.
Oh,
and so
okay.
The idea with that is that someone can crave. You can crave and you can want. You could sit, and for those of you who've been addicted to cigarettes,
or sugar, or TV, or
anything
gambling,
like that,
or anything.
But cigarettes in particular is poignant for this because they'll say, "Oh, I really want a cigarette. I'd like to go out and grab a cigarette." Then they go and they grab a cigarette. And you know all the sensory components of that. There's smoke that makes their hands smell, and you kind of feel a little bit nauseous. They have a bad taste in your mouth, and they come back and think, "Why did I do that? I don't even like it. I don't even like the taste. I don't like anything about it. I don't like having to buy it. I don't have to keep track of them." If you ask them, they don't like actually smoking. But what the problem is that it's that wanting that precedes it, which is where the dopamine signaling occurs. And what happens with dopamine signaling is that it first starts off when you're first learning something, when you're first being exposed to something that's rewarding, it actually codes for the thing that's coming, that's delivered. It's the unconditioned stimulus. It codes that. But over time, it starts tracking the earlier and earlier predictors of that outcome, which are the conditioned components. So dopamine now is signaling the earliest predictors of some outcome. And so that's how dopamine signaling is actually, tracking and motivating people to do things.
Wow. So how would we use that? So you've described it in a negative habit on why it drives us to do that. Mm-hmm. How do we reverse engineer that and we go, okay, let's say we want to work out every day.
Right.
That's an important thing. How can we then, or can we literally use dopamine to our advantage to create that sense of, ooh, I want to do that, and start tracking for, man, I've got to have that workout, or I've got to have that healthy shake or whatever.
Right. So back when I was a professor, I gave a keynote speech about for the faculty teaching excellence program and I think it was neuropedagogy, what monkey neurons can tell us about teaching in the classroom. And that was this topic about how can we as professors, how can we organize our material, our curriculum in order to maximize attention and maximize the little dopamine surges. And so what are the tools that we have in a classroom is that you can give pop quizzes and you can give extra credit and you can do things like that. But knowing that monkeys respond to unexpected positive reward, periodically, what I would employ in class is periodically would give some pop extra credit and say, okay, now we're going to stop what we're doing, and if you do this, then you can get 1 point extra credit. And so what that would do is it would hold their attention. And so attention and reward are fundamentally linked. So if you're trying to modify your lifestyle or somebody else's, it's easier if you're parenting or something like that and you want to keep your kids motivated. Mm-hmm. Then periodically switch things up when they're doing something and then give them some positive thing that they want, but they don't expect it. And then they'll always be attentive to when you walk in the room, they're going to be like, okay, something could happen, something may not happen, but the idea that it's not predictable is the best way to keep an organism, even a human, attentive. And so it's called a partial extinction effect. So when you start extinguishing something and people expect something, it doesn't come. And they expect it doesn't come. Then eventually they're like, okay, I'm not going to attend to this anymore because I've decayed, I've extinguished. Yeah. But then if you expect something, it doesn't come, and then it does come. Then they're like, okay, I don't know what to do, but that's the optimal way to keep someone motivated is by giving them intermittent rewards.
Wow. And does that include verbal attaboys? Like if I said, man, Don, the work that you did on this was fantastic. If I give you that kind of verbal feedback intermittently when I feel it from my heart, does that create the same dopamine hit as giving them an unexpected reward that's tangible?
Well, think about what happens to your dopamine signaling if every single time we interacted, you said, oh, that's great, that's fantastic, that's the best thing I've ever seen. Well, then what happens when you're having a bad day and you don't do that? And there's an omission. Yes. What happens to my dopamine?
you're going to be sad.
It goes down.
Yeah, you're going to be like, oh, no dopamine here.
He's what's wrong? What did I do? I'm expecting this, and all of a sudden, and then what does that mean? That means it goes down, and now it's something else. It's something I'm demotivated to do something. So ideally, you establish, I think, a genuine relationship with someone where you give them praise when they do something that's actually worthwhile and meritorious. And if they don't, then you kind of have to give them the same kind of feedback. You kind of have to say, okay, that was great, but let's work on this. And then they understand that it can go both ways, and then they can try to bias you towards one way, but it has to still kind of be intermittent.
Right. Absolutely. No, that makes sense. What about if we want to drive our own dopamine levels? Exercise a good form of driving?
Oh, absolutely.
Dopamine stim?
Absolutely, because it's just like when I said with rats or mice that are running around on cocaine, they run around. When you have excess levels of dopamine, it makes you want to move. So it's the same way when you exercise. When you exercise, you're actually stimulating dopamine. Another thing that activates it that's really important is your circadian rhythm. So if you take out circadian rhythm is the activation across the day. So it's when our light cycle and our dark cycle. And if you disrupt your sleep architecture or your patterns like that, you go travel and you have jet lag, then you can become anhedonic, where you have low dopamine levels. But dopamine definitely is tied to your sleep architecture, your activity levels, things like that.
I've heard that. In fact, that same Dr. Huberman that I was telling you about, he did some fabulous sessions on sleep. And his big thing is saying, hey, listen, between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., no lights.
Yeah.
And of course with shift workers, all of this changes, but no lights at all. Forget blocking out blue light.
Absolutely.
Or no lights, because it will really hammer your dopamine system. And it done long-term can have serious psychological effects.
Yeah. This is so funny because my wife is still, over the holidays, I got these smart bulbs. Where you can control the color. It's like a rainbow colors. I changed all of my light bulbs in the house to these LED smart bulbs. So I can control the colors on all of them, put them on a schedule.
Which determines the frequency, right?
Yeah,
that's why you change the colors.
So in one thing that we used to do in graduate schools, in animal rooms, you'd put them on a light dark cycle, but if you have to go in there, and the animals can't see red light. So it would just be a red light in there. And the nice thing about, red light is that it doesn't really interfere with your circadian rhythms, whereas the blue certainly does.
Right.
So I have in my house now, at a certain time, all of the lights turn red. So it's like, my wife's like, this looks like a brothel. And I'm like, bro, I've never been in a brothel, but to me, it looks like an animal room, right? So when I go into my kid's room and their lights are on and it's 10 o'clock, I tell them, turn off the lights. It's very important because we are so entrained by light, and it can shift your circadian rhythms. And if your circadian rhythms are shifted, your sleep architecture gets disrupted. And it's really what happens during sleep is that's when our memories are consolidated. That's where we attach our emotions to the events that happen, and that's how we form long-term memories. So if you are unable to get good quality sleep, then you can't form good memories. You can't attach emotional salience to the things that you've experienced in the day. So it's fundamentally important.
Does that include memory as well as memories? Like if you don't get good sleep, if you have a test, these people that want to crush the all-nighter to get ready for the test, how does that
they take amphetamines, they boost their dopamine and it makes them aroused and alert. They are incredibly confident when they go in because it makes you feel, like I can take on anything, and then they blow the exam. Right. So it's bad if you don't get good sleep architecture, and this was done, Matt Wilson at MIT really pioneered this, showing that what happens during sleep is if you take an animal and you have them run through a maze and they learn the maze, and then you monitor them, the neurons that went in sequence as they went through the maze that code for the direction. You can tell which neurons are coding it. Then you look at their next opportunity to sleep. What you see is a compression and a replay of that thousands and thousands of times while they're sleeping. So what the animal is doing is they're just consolidating what they did, but it's compressed 100 times.
Yes.
So it's running 100 times faster. So if we didn't have that, if you sleep deprive someone, you deprive them the opportunity to consolidate literally memories.
Wow. What about, so here's where this is going, and I didn't know where our conversation was going to go, because again, this is going to be a series, and we're going to bring all kinds of things to the forefront and into the light. But so far, we've talked about the importance of exercise and dopamine. We've talked about the importance of sleep and memory formation, proper function, even mental well-being. What about if we put, if any comments do you have about nutrients, the type of things we put in our body as it relates to some of these brain function and optimization chemicals? Any thoughts on food choices, food types, when we eat, anything like that?
Well, our physiology is such that, there's recently, I think one of the biggest things that's happened over the past decade is this idea of microbiota.
On the microbiome, our gut bugs.
Our gut.
Yep.
And that the gut is our second brain,
yes.
And that there's this interface between the gut-brain interface. And so what we're seeing, and I have some colleagues, Dr. James Bibb, who's at University of Alabama, Birmingham, and he's been pioneering this stuff where he feeds animals, he calls it a ho-ho diet, which is basically just Twinkies. Mm-hmm. And then he monitors some of their body weight and physiological liver function and all these, physiological biochemical markers. And then he measures them on measures of anxiety and measures of depression and resilience, and finds that what you might expect is that if you have a bad diet, you're not getting good nutrients. It makes you more vulnerable to anxiety. It makes you more vulnerable to sleep disruption. It makes you more vulnerable to depression. So all of those things, our diet in many ways shapes our internal microbiota, or the trillions of cells, and that interface with our immune system is fundamental for us maintaining our physiology and our mental function and our emotional function.
So basically, as we've always known, that the things that we put into our mind, the things we put into our mouth, and the movement we get every day, when you look at those three things, that's in part going to determine so much more than how we look. It's going to determine how we feel and how we function, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think a big component of that is also epigenetics. And so that you have
define epigenetics for those people that don't know what that means, because it's a term that has come. We used to think that we were completely ruled by genetics. Like, hey man, whatever your genes get, you're tied to that. Now with the epigenetics understanding that we have, it's a whole new game. It's like, yeah, epigenetics is really where it's at over genetics, but we have so much more control over the epigenetics, not only for ourselves, but potentially even for generations down the line from us, right?
Yeah, transgenerational epigenetics. And that was one of the first demonstrations of that was, again, with cocaine self-administration in rodents, where they found that, they fed fathers, they allowed them to self-administer cocaine, and then they looked at their offspring and found that they were less likely. And that was across an entire generation. So you want me to define epigenetics. So I guess what you can think about gene regulation, you might think about transcriptional activation. And transcriptional activation is where you take a gene that is part of your genetic makeup, that's part of your chromosomal DNA. And each one of those genes can be turned on or turned off, and under certain circumstances. And hormones are a particular good example of a nuclear transcription factor that gets into the nucleus and will turn, like estrogen or testosterone. If you give someone testosterone, it turns on genes that produce muscle.
So the hormone testosterone goes into the system and it turns on the gene that makes you more muscular.
Right, and it turns that on, but that's doing it through a transcriptional receptor pathway. Epigenetics is somewhat similar, but it's only somewhat recently that they've really discovered what the epigenetics are. And that's where you have certain enzymes that can put methyl groups on transcription, on genes that are transcription factors that can unfold them and unpack them and make them more accessible to transcription factors. So if you have a gene,
they're enhancers of in this case, the testosterone. They're going to make it easier.
If you have a gene that's all bound up and knotted up and these factors can't get to it, then it won't be expressed. So a epigenetic methylation would come in here and it would unpack that
unwind
gene. It would unwind it, and then all of a sudden it exposes all of these elements that can be acted on by something like testosterone or estrogen or the hormones, and then it can be expressed. So it's whether or not these genes are packed or unpacked. And so if you're packing up all of these particular genes, then it doesn't matter how much transcription factors you have. And it turns out that a lot of things that we do, our physiology, can be determined. Even plastics, for example. Everyone's talking about these plastics that get into the water and how they could act as pseudo hormones like estrogens, things like that. And people are saying, well, is this linked to autism? And how come we're having such an increase in autism lately? And then we look at environmental factors and we're seeing that there's all these plastics. And then we say, well, what's the relationship between plastics and our mental state or our behavior? And then you find out that they're epigenetic modulators, that you can actually turn on certain sets of genes or silence others, and that can have dramatic effects on behavior.
So the plastic, in this case, the tiny little bits of plastic that they're finding in the oceans that get in our system are unwinding or unpacking, making that autism gene more able to be expressed.
Let's just say that you have 100 genes that might be involved with autism in various combinatorial manners. And so that's why there isn't some, smoking gun or silver bullet about, is there one gene? Mm-hmm. For most of these complex phenotypes like schizophrenia, autism, there's multiple genes that are all interacting. But if you have...
Makes sense, right? It's a recipe.
Yeah, it's not just one gene, unless it's a D1 receptor and it's cocaine, in which case we do know that at least you can knock that out and totally eliminate the response. But for a lot of these complex phenotypes, it's like autism, you need to have a certain hit from multiple hits. And some genes may be more important than others, don't get me wrong. You can produce models with one gene. But for the most part, having environmental factors that might be diet, that are plastics, that can activate certain enzymes, can cause epigenetic changes. And those epigenetic changes can lead to... it's hypothesized that it could lead to autism. So because we have a problem, if you want to talk about autism, we have a problem in that why are autism rates so high in the United States, where in Africa it's not? Mm-hmm. And what is it about it being an industrial society? And so we have to start looking at everything. You have to look at what are we taking in? How do we produce our food? How do we change from an agrarian society and how we get our food to now going to the supermarket and packaging and all those things?
And that's how we got to look at, everything, right? Like if we look at our cancer rates versus other countries, because we're all humans. So we have, what about our cancer rates, our autism rates, our obesity rates? We have to look at that from so many levels. It's not just, we put more food in our mouth than another country. It's, what's that food made of? What are the nutrients in it? How does it work? What's the food desert, the climate? All these things have to be considered in all this stuff. Is that right?
You also have to consider who benefits from having where we're at and the trajectory we're on. And for a good example of that might be when people start criticizing big pharma, and they say, well, how come there's a 600% increase in attention deficit, diagnoses over a 10-year period? How's that even possible in the United States only and not anywhere else in the world? And then you find out that certain drug companies ramped up their production by 600%, and they're pitching it to pediatricians. Mm-hmm. And then the pediatricians are saying, oh, okay, you have ADHD, here's some amphetamines, here's some Ritalin. And so who profits from that? I think you can see that there is if you want to be cynical, I think it's important not only to look at how we as a society have kind of organically evolved, but I do think that there are some players that bias the marketplace and bias our things like this. Some of the pathologies that we have, like attention deficit disorder and autism, I tend to look at who's benefiting.
That's a great point. And, I want to move into now what is a really, really hot topic. And we don't have to, it's certainly not between you and I, not a political topic. So I don't want to take it there, but rather I want to take a view at a cynical side, which is COVID. So you are, in my mind, I consider you my COVID expert, because you've spent so much time looking at the different types, the diseases, how things play out. As you look at COVID right now, where do you see it going? You shared something with me that blew my mind, and it was that because now we're in the Omicron strain. Who knows what the next strain will be, when it'll be, how it'll take place. But you shared something with me that I found so fascinating, and it was like, okay, listen. so many of these different strains seem to come from Africa, with the reason being that so many Africans, unfortunately, have HIV. And as such, their immune systems are really low. And so they don't have the power to withstand the onslaught of the virus. And so assuming they live with a lower level immune system, that virus is mutating hundreds of times in that body. And so it can change radically. So now one of those people that's in that predicament gives it to someone who gets on a plane, who goes somewhere. Now all of a sudden, here we have this new version. Give us a little bit more what your thought process is on this whole thing that is COVID. Where you see it going, if you can. I mean, I don't mean you to have to foretell the future, but based on that model, I'm like, it's never going to end. There's always going to be mutations coming somewhere from something. Is that accurate? Is that true?
Well, that was a good summary of what we talked about with, and it's something that I don't think you hear a lot about. Why are the variants coming out of South Africa? And that was a question that I had. We've got 2 of them right now. One of them came out of India, Delta. And then how is it that you can get something? What are the evolutionary forces that would drive mutation in a coronavirus or in any virus? And what we knew is that people who are immune compromised, they can't eliminate the virus. So if they don't die, then it can stay in their body for over 6 months. And there was a paper published in this last year showing that in one particular HIV patient that they had like 300 mutations and different strains all in one person who didn't die.
That's amazing.
But it was called in vivo mutations. It's something that can happen it's called intra-host mutations.
Yep. So inside the living host,
right?
Intra and in vivo inside the living host.
That's
basically.
right. And so if you can all you need is one person to create your new super strain, one person who's immune compromised, it really helps us understand. A lot of people are cynical and have a short-sighted view about why do we spend any money in Africa? What good would that do? Why do we want to eliminate malaria? We don't have malaria here. Well, if you look at HIV, it used to be a problem for us, a big problem when it was first coming out in the 80s, and it was highly politicized. And then we spent a whole bunch of money trying to understand the mechanism and the triple cocktail, and then antiretroviral drugs. And eventually, now it's something that can be easily managed, if not completely eradicated from a person. But that's not the case in Africa right now. So in South Africa, you have 12 million people who are HIV positive out of a country that has 60 million people.
Wow.
So if you can imagine going to the store, 1 in 5 people would have HIV. Now, it's also a poor country and may not have access to antiretroviral drugs. So if you take a certain fraction of those people, let's say 10%, you have 1 million people walking around that are not being treated, that are basically on their way towards becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. And so if they get infected with a particular variant, then that they can host that. If they don't die, they can mutate, it can mutate. And then the most successful mutations will then spread, and only the most successful ones will spread. And then they'll get into Johannesburg Airport, as you said, and they'll spread to the rest of the world. So when we think about a pandemic, we have to think globally. We have to think about not just getting boosters for our kids, right, which is where everyone's talking about, but we have to take some of that and we have to put it into Africa, because of the interface between HIV and coronavirus right now. That's where the next that's where it's going to happen. That's where we're going to get something that's going to be even more devastating potentially. It could go the other way too, is that you have a limited genome and it's only the best mutations can come out, and we've already hit that point, and Omicron is the pinnacle. Maybe it's already gone through this, and Omicron is as good as it's going to get. It's saturated its ability to be the best at transmissibility, which it is. I mean, it's better than almost anything we've ever seen.
So easier to transmit, meaning far more contagious, but also the data seem to show that it's not as virulent or as potent. Is that the right term as some of the previous versions?
Right. And there's a game that I'm blanking on. It's an app that you can play where basically it's about destroying the world. And you can decide on this game, you can create a virus and then you can decide how lethal it is or how not lethal and how its transmissibility. And you can play this. And the goal is to destroy everyone. And
wow,
so,
not a game I want to spend my time on.
I know. But it is kind of instructive because my kids and I were playing this a couple of years ago, and it's like you have to have strategies. You don't want to choose something like Ebola, where it's got a couple of days. You get it, you start to bleed out, and then somebody touches you, and then they're dead in 2 days because it can't spread very, very effectively. Your ideal scenario is something that is incredibly transmissible, but won't kill you very quickly. You know, it takes time because you can infect more and more and more people. With Omicron, it looks like the transmissibility is saturated. It's incredibly effective and that's why we're having, positivity rates went from last week, 8.5 to now it's about 18% in 7 days because of that. But if you look at hospitalizations and death, things like that, it doesn't look like it's as severe. So that's a good thing. You don't want these to, ideally, you don't want it at all, but if you had to choose, I guess this is a scenario where there may be a silver lining because if a lot of people who are not protected or don't have access to monoclonal antibodies or these other therapies, if they're getting a less severe disease, but everyone's getting it, it becomes you think of it like chicken pox.
Yeah, it becomes almost like it's creating the herd mentality with the least amount of long-term destruction.
I mean, if that, and that's certainly not the way you want to think about it in general. Let's say everybody get infected, but if it turns out to be a less severe variant and it's more transmissible, and what's really interesting is that this just came out a couple of days ago, is that people who have Omicron, they are resistant to Delta and the other variants. Their antibodies are capable of neutralizing those previous variants. It doesn't work the other way around. Delta, if you're previously infected with Delta, you can still get Omicron and still get sick. But if you have Omicron, then it does protect you against the others. So we might be at a point where Omicron is actually something that if a lot of people get it, they are protected against previous variants. If we don't have new variants coming out, then there might be, we might be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
Right. So we might have turned the corner on the thing from that perspective.
Hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
I'm going to end the show on this topic of where we're heading with the show, with you and I in particular. We have brought on and introduced a medical sciences division within the firm, of which you head up. And everyone, if you're listening to this, you can see why Dr. Cooper heads this up. His brain it fills this room. It's huge. And he's so into the studying and so into the math and the research and the science. It's amazing. But our medical sciences division, the reason Dr. Ramos wanted to bring that on is because of his training in both the clinical side and the academia side of saying, I want to help people understand and help them if they have been injured in a sense that they shouldn't have been injured. So we're taking the approach in the medical sciences division that if someone has been injured from a product that the people who made the product should have known better. They should have known better because the research showed that there were some issues here, or as soon as it did show, they should have stopped it. So that's one side of what we're doing. And another side is people who have been injured by vaccines. And I bring that up now because we were just talking about Omicron and COVID and coronavirus and that kind of thing. And of course, one of the big ways that people are trying to get ahead of this thing is through vaccinations. And while you and I know that not everybody gets injured from any kind of vaccination, we also have seen, unfortunately, through now many, many stories of people we've spoken with, through the VAERS reports, through just a number of ways, that not everything is good for everybody. And so we've seen some people get injured. At the end of the day, you and I are going to start talking about this. We'll have a whole episode on this, but can you just speak a little bit to how a vaccine that's meant to help somebody could actually cause a potential harm, whether it be short-term and just a little thing or a long-term thing? How does that happen? Because everyone's doing all this research and try to do the best that they can, but people are getting injured. How does that happen?
How do we connect vaccines, the goal of making a vaccine to activate the immune system so that it recognizes a future encounter with the pathogen? And how do we prevent that? How do we prevent that, or what are the mechanisms of that?
I think, let's just say, for an example, if someone gets a regular flu vaccine, right? So if we can somehow rewind our minds prior to COVID, which is almost impossible now, it's so indelled as a neural pathway, I think. But when you look at...
I don't think people considered vaccines before COVID.
No, they didn't. I know I didn't.
So it's not like they had to undo anything. It's that now they've just learned a whole bunch of confusing information.
Right. So if we rewind pre-COVID, some people got flu shots, some people did not. Some people that got flu shots got really ill. Some of them had flu-like symptoms. Some of them had neurological issues where there was an administration site issue. In other words, the person administering the vaccine did it incorrectly, improperly, and it caused a local and a radicular or a radiating type symptom. But there are other people who got a reaction, allergic reaction of some sort, to where most people didn't, but some people did, and it caused up to and including death, but not for everybody. For some people, it was a long-term disability. How does that happen? Why is it not safe for everybody?
Well, it's because what you're really talking about is activating a person's immune system. And how can we specifically activate someone's immune system to a specific pathogen? And
that's what vaccines do, right? You try to get the immune system to kick up based on stimulating it with what you introduce.
Right. And the previous method that was used to do that is by taking a heat-killed virus, is to actually take the virus and disable it. And then package it, grow it up, and then kill it, and then inject it. And then your body automatically recognizes the surface proteins on this dead virus and says this doesn't belong here. And then your body takes over from that. Now, anybody who's looked at immunology knows it's one of the most complicated fields of study, because there's so many different components to immune activation, including interferons and cytokines and things that cause inflammation and increase blood flow, and then all sorts of cellular activation and neutralizing antibodies, and it's on and on and on. It's incredibly complicated. And part of that complication is, one of the same, questions you might have is, what about multiple sclerosis or any autoimmune disease? How do those things work? And that's when your body's immune system suddenly recognizes something that should be familiar, and it attacks it. And so we don't understand completely how the immune system actually works. So we understand a lot more about how to engineer something that the immune system is going to say, hey, this doesn't belong. And really that's what's happened with these mRNA viruses that are different from, vaccines, versus the previous flu vaccines, which were heat killed. Now, what they're doing with this mRNA vaccines is more akin to gene therapy than what we would consider traditional vaccination, because it's not using a heat killed virus. It's actually using an engineered part of an external protein, the spike protein, and then arranging it in the correct conformational state, packaging that up in a nanoparticle, and then getting it so that your cells take it in, and then tricking the cells into making a protein.
But some people, their cells, when they end up getting tricked not only to take it in as a protein to help, but then they're going to have this reaction, just like in the heat killed. Some people, it didn't react. Why is that? Because I guess what I'm really getting at is, let's say you and I both get a vaccine, and for you it's fine. For me, I get either a local or a long-standing thing. Is it because of my individual biology being different from yours in a way that nobody can ever predict? Is that why I would get an injury as opposed to you?
I don't think it's any different than some kids have peanut allergies. I mean, why can one person have some peanuts and another person needs an EpiPen because they can't breathe, because they're exposed to peanuts, or shellfish allergies, it's odd, isn't it? Because there's just one person who responds very radically, but what it does is it shows you how powerful the immune system can be and how quickly it can respond. And then if it doesn't like something and it's slightly biased in the wrong way, then it can cause inflammatory cascades that are toxic. And this is actually what happened with the original SARS back in 2004. We're at SARS-2, right? There was a SARS. It didn't last very long, but it was so toxic the spike protein and everything, when it infected somebody, it was so toxic that the immune system would activate so powerfully with interferons and cytokines that it was actually those cascades that caused the pathology in the lungs and that would kill people. So it was the hyper responsiveness of the immune system to that particular pathogen.
So it did what it was supposed to do, but it
Too
did
well.
it too well, too much, and it created the host suffering, right? Up to death.
And there are individual differences in all of us and how we respond. Going back to the beginning with, how much control do we have and how much control do we have over our physiology? Everybody, there are individual differences. There are responders, there are non-responders. And so you can have a full range of people. So 1 in 30,000 people may have an adverse reaction that's very serious to a vaccine injury, and it's serious for them. So we have to have a program, we have to have a way to help these people, because it's a real injury. And right now, the government has taken away our ability to sue companies. So we can't go after Pfizer. We can't go after anybody along the chain who even administers the vaccines. Even if they stab you in the wrong way, you have a shoulder injury, they're immune according by law. So there is a program that's set up to compensate people that protects the companies so that they can continue making vaccines so that they don't feel like, hey, this isn't worth it. Why would I do that if everyone's going to sue us, right?
Right.
So there's this tension between protecting as many people as possible and protecting the corporate interests of allowing them to do that, and also fighting for the people who are actually suffering from this and what happens to their life.
Yeah, protecting them
when they have
injured.
a problem.
Yeah,
we have
point.
to be, and I feel like we have to speak up for them because no one is fighting for them right now. The program is not allowing people right now with COVID vaccines, injuries. They're not paying for those injuries right now because it's not fully approved, but there are still people suffering.
Right. And I think, and if this whets your appetite as a listener, if you are like, whoa, wait a minute, you just said something that struck home. You mean people actually can get hurt from vaccines? Ooh, I wonder if I was hurt because we're going to do a whole episode on that, and we're going to do that sooner rather than later. So we'll be sharing that with you. But in the meantime, if you have questions, please, reach out to us at Ramos Law, and we will definitely get you in touch with Dr. Cooper, and we can talk about that. And so as we end, I want to go through this. And by the way, if you want to get a hold of us, you can go to ramoslaw.com. You can call 303-733-6353 and ask for Dr. Cooper, and we can go through different situations and scenarios. But again, we'll do another show on this. We're going to talk about our medical sciences division. Today was just to help you to get to know Dr. Cooper, what he's about, some of the stuff going on in his mind, some of the cool stuff that you could apply. And I think this episode was filled with that. In fact, I know it was stuff that's actionable for me, with whether it's dopamine, my sleep, what I eat, my exercise, all the stuff. It reinforces why it's so important to choose a healthy lifestyle to take care of not only our epigenetics, but our dopamine centers and all these cool things. So Dr. Cooper, before I let you go, let me ask you this. With all the things you've learned, and you've learned plenty, is there any piece of advice that you've learned along the way that now is kind of a benchmark for you, or that you were taught as a young man that you would want to share with our audience as far as a way to live the best life possible? One piece of advice. Anything?
As a neuropharmacologist, I see a lot of people tell me about all these drugs that they're taking, medications. Polypharmacy is a big problem. And
polypharmacy being too many medications in a person.
Polypharmacy is that somebody goes to the doctor and they're given this for this particular malady, and then this clinical sign, your cholesterol's too high, so you get a statin, and your blood pressure's too high, so you take a blood pressure medication, and you're having migraines, so you take this one, and you're depressed, so you take this one. So before you know it, people are taking 10 different medications. And if there's one thing that we know about physiology, is that everything in our body is homeostasis. Homeostasis is this this need, if you will, to maintain a balance. So if a system goes in this direction, there's a tension and a force that wants to pull it back this way. If you're sleep deprived, then you want to sleep. If you have gone for a long time without food, you're hungry.
You want to eat. Yeah.
Right? And so homeostasis is the fundamental thing that defines our physiology. And when you take drugs that you just randomly take 10 different drugs, they all have different kinetics. And it will tip the balance in so many different ways of your physiology that people end up being very miserable. And so even as a pharmacologist, I hate drugs because of what they can do. They make you dependent. And so I would say to someone, one lesson I've learned is that drugs are bad, but you should really pay attention to your body's homeostasis. And that means everything you just said: eating well, make sure you have good nutrients, and getting good sleep. Those are the first two things I tell people. And I say, if you're taking a lot of drugs, let's start looking very critically at the drugs you're taking, because they affect every single cell in your body. And let's see if we can get it back down to where you don't have so many extremes in your homeostasis. So I think the fundamental thing I've learned is homeostasis is so critical, and we have to do everything we can to not go. And it's almost like a Buddhist principle of the middle way.
Yes.
Don't do extremes. Stay in the middle, and things should be okay.
Let's be Zen, baby.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this was fun, man, Dr. Cooper. I enjoyed myself immensely. These are the conversations you and I have, on the regular in the office, but to be able to share with the audience. And again, people, if this meant something to you, if you listen to this with an open ear and not from even a scientific ear, how does this apply to me? There are lessons in here. There are nuggets for you to apply. Please, if you take this and you find value, share it with someone. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, podcasts. You can get them wherever you find those things. Ramos Law, you can find it. Our podcast is The Difference Makers, Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast. Please, let's get this message out there. There's more to come. Dr. Cooper's going to be here, a regular guest on the show with me, and we'll have more to do. But in the meantime, I hope 2022 is starting out incredible for you. And should you need anything, you can always reach out to us. Dr. Cooper gave some information. And if you want to reach out to me directly, it's jim@ramoslaw.com. And until next time, remember, just keep getting out there and make a difference.